Hello and welcome to Winging It. Winging It is a show by Oddbird about web design, development, and our approach to solving problems. Today we'll be diving into the hot topic of fluid web typography and what happens when users have their own opinions. I'm joined by Oddbird's own Miriam Suzanne, as well as special guest Richard Rutter. Richard hi. Thanks for joining us. I will give you a proper introduction before cutting you off. Richard is a designer living in Brighton, UK. In 2005, he co-founded Clear Left, a digital design consultancy, as well as having a background in UX and service design. Richard describes himself as a self-appointed web typography evangelist. He organized Clear Left's series of ampersand web typography conferences, and in 2017 published his book Web Typography, which he promises is undergoing a second edition rewrite. Rich, when should we expect that?
I'm not making any promises. This time next year is not a promise, but maybe.
That's a good answer. We were talking this morning. We were talking this morning about how we've been fans of you since sometime just after you founded that company. Following your work for a long time.
Oh, thank you.
Really a pleasure to have you here.
No, very much my privilege to be here. Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Great. So this conversation started because I was playing around with my user preferences in various browsers because I realized I have preferences, and I thought I should tell the browser that I have those preferences. So I started playing around, and then I wrote an article about it, and then you wrote a response article recently, and it was really good, and I thought it would be fun to chat about it. To get people caught up on my basic question that started all of this, I'll share a screen here. I have to allow all sorts of things. Open system settings. Oh no. Okay.
I wonder if you have to do that every time Chrome updates.
I'm not in Chrome, but wild. Can I not share my screen?
I don't know. Is there anything you want me to share, or do you think?
Share screen.
There.
Yeah, do you want to share? I mean, well, I was going to go to my website just as an example. Yeah, it won't let me do it. Sorry, I didn't expect that to fail. So I was playing with the preferences on my own website, which uses sort of a common approach to responsive typography. It's a clamp function that has, I don't remember, mine is a little bit weird. I was playing around with some things, so I have like a max function in there and something, but it's basically the usual clamp from 1M to something else with the middle value, the dynamic value, allowing it to scale based on the viewport size. So it's like some fraction of M's plus if you...
I needed open, it wouldn't share my tool, my inspector, just the screen. So that's why
it's that sort of, it's sort of conventional when we talk about fluid typography that taking into account a type size so that can change based on user preferences, and then adding in an extra bit of the calculation that takes into account the viewport size, so you've got that adjustment going on there, and then it's how you combine those two together. But
it's Stacy, it's the root variable on the HTML
right here.
Yeah, so it's got a little bit of weird stuff going on, but it's basically that that basic calculation that a lot of people are using, a clamp and a viewport unit in the middle. And I was playing around then with setting my user preferences. Well, so the first thing I noticed is right now, the default preference that I have set in the browser is 16 pixel font size. And the result is something around, I think, 24 pixels for my body font, the result of the calculation. But if I go into my user preferences and I change my user preference to 24 pixels, suddenly the font size on my website jumps up to 33 or something. And I just thought, well, wait, am I doing this right if the font size on my website never reflects actually the preference that I set? That was the basic question that I wanted to ask. And then I went down a lot of rabbit holes in my post, and I didn't come to a conclusion that I was terribly happy with. But I sort of talked through some of the things I was thinking about. Do you have any immediate reactions to just sort of that problem? What does it mean if our preferences are never perfectly reflected?
So my first thought was, well, yeah, you have set that as 24 pixels, and that's never going to happen, or at least not on your website and the way that that's done. Ironically, on sort of older websites that don't really use any fluid typography,
Right.
then they probably are, depending on how type is set. But then I was thinking, well, when you set that 24 pixels as your kind of preferred default base font size, is that what you're saying? Is you saying you always want it to be 24 pixels, regardless of the context, regardless of the website, regardless of the size of the windows that you might have, if you've got quite a few lined up or working in different sorts of ways? In some ways, it's your setting, so only you know the answer to that. But I think the answer is a bit more complicated.
Yeah.
But it certainly is the case where, and also just to bring into that, maybe prematurely, but it's quite difficult to work out how you go and make those settings, and you do it in different places.
Yeah.
Instead, you had to click through quite a few different panes to get to that 24 pixel bit. In Safari, you have to do it through an actual user style sheet, like proper old school, and then Firefox has its own UI for doing it. So you can do that, but it's kind of hidden away, and it's a bit easier to bump up and down your prefer from medium to large or something like that, but you haven't got fine grained control. But I don't know, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I was sort of thinking through a bit. It's like, well, why as designers do we bother changing the text size at all then? Because when things like headings, obviously they get bigger. You could just use HTML with no CSS, or at least no kind of authored CSS at all, and the headings are still going to get bigger. So that happens for a reason. And then as designers, we can change how that happens. And so, are we changing the base font size which we typically use for your paragraphs? Are we changing that for a good reason or not? It does seem odd that it would suddenly be 1.5 times as big as you thought it was going to be.
Yeah, that's the argument that Adrian Roselli makes that I found really interesting in his article about the bestest base font size that everyone is keeping secret, which is just letting the user set it.
There was a really interesting bit at the end of that. It might have been in either a comment that Adrian left or a pointer he made at the end of the article, I can't remember, where someone pointed out, so I'm guessing it was in the comments, that, well, your site doesn't have paragraph set at the 16 pixels that I have in my user preferences. And so Adrian said, that's because I like my voice to be loud. Some people might disagree with that. And so it's like even someone like Adrian is sort of going against that advice, but he has a reason for it.
Right. Yeah.
And, it does make things a little bit more subjective than maybe we think. But it is really important that whatever we do as designers, when it comes to setting the type size, it has to somehow reflect those preferences. If people are saying, I want to bump this up, even if they're doing it on a site-by-site basis, I want to bump the text size up on this site because it's just too, right now it's too small for me. And so that should happen. And we shouldn't stop that happening, which we can do very easily, sometimes inadvertently. And so I think that's the most important thing, but yeah, it does still raise a bit of an existential question.
Yeah, I mean, abstracting the question a little bit, I think what I was really, like, I don't care if I set my user preference to 24 and I don't actually get 24. That's not the piece that I'm too worried about. But what I was noticing was sites that I love because they have larger typography, and I like larger typography. Suddenly, the type on those sites was too large for me. So my issue was less that it wasn't matching exactly, and instead I was concerned that setting my preference for larger type meant now the sites that already had that were getting too large, and the sites that didn't have it were now the right size. And there was no way for me to get all of the sites to just say, just bring up the bottom, just raise up the sites that have small font size, but don't make it larger on sites that already have. So that's where I started playing with that sort of like, is it reasonable to use maxes in here somewhere, to say, my site, I'm designing my site, I want large type on it. But if you've increased your user font size, don't start increasing based on that until you catch up to me. If you set your font to 24, your user preference to 24 pixels, and I've set my site default to 24 pixels, we should agree. We should just we should agree at that point. And I don't need to get bigger just because you moved from the 16 pixel default. I don't know if there's a good solution there.
The other solution, it's not really a solution, but it's sort of is putting the onus on the web browser itself. So just making it really easy if you go to the site and however the text is sized, to be able to bump it up and down really easily, and just the text size, so not a page zoom. Right. And again, you can do that, but sometimes that's harder to do in browsers, and not all browsers will remember your preference. I think that's an important part of it as well. So there's, a certain argument that the designers are kind of breaking the experience, but you can fix it really easily as a reader to just by bumping up and down, and it's going to get close enough. And as long as it gets remembered, then you've gone, some of the way there. So yes, it's sort of changing the onus and ignoring the question to some degree. But again, if you've coded it right, then readers can do that. They have control. They have control over so much, and so kind of why not that? And so I think as designers, we can do what we think is right. And one of the reasons that we might want to bump text size up is because 97% of people, according to one survey, don't ever change their text size. But that doesn't mean that base size of 16 pixels is right on on a big screen. See my hands, it's like my screen's at least that big at the moment, and I want bigger text than 16 pixels. But I haven't gone in and changed my base font size. But when I'm this far away as well, I want the text to be a bit bigger, because if I have a phone this close to my hand, like this, I want that text to be smaller, and you've got that sort of small far away thing going on there as well. So it's like, is it incumbent on designers to make that, or do you actually rely on just your readers solely to bump up the size as they want to? I think there's a certain onus on designers to try and have a good stab at that first of all.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I agree. And I like the idea of putting onus on the browsers, except that it seems to me the browsers have moved the opposite direction. and so I don't trust them to take up that responsibility. I feel like they keep hiding preferences further and further away, and making it so it really is only something that experts use instead of something that everybody feels like they can.
Yeah, and you did that really good article a while back on the different kinds of zoom that's available, and the page zoom, which effectively mimics pinch zooming on a phone, is often the default. And so you don't get any of those sorts of benefits that we're talking about in terms of just being able to bump up and down the text size. If all you know how to do is do the page zoom thing, which sort of achieves it, but it's not always very helpful.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, Stacy there with the link.
That's quick. Yeah.
I like that Sue Austin in the chat is trying to work out exactly what the approach would be to say, take the user's font size or start larger, but when they catch up with me, increase. I don't know exactly what the answer is there, but I think it's an interesting thing to play with. The other thing that we got into in our back and forth of posts a little bit was sort of what does an M represent? Theoretically in a designer's mind or in a developer's mind. And I think we just have we ended up with code that looked very similar, but I think we had slightly different mental models for getting there.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. And I think so the important factor of the code was what I sort of mentioned earlier on. It takes viewport size into account, and it takes user preferences into account, because it will use rems or ems, and so that will one way or another take into account those user preferences. But how you combine those together, whether you're using what looks like magic numbers or whether it's just rule of thumb with some sort of rounder numbers, is an interesting process, really. And I thought one of the points that you made, I forget exactly how, Miriam, but that thing around, as you just said, what is a rem? How do we conceptualize that as a designer without just turning it into what we're most used to seeing, which is 16 pixels? But of course, isn't always. It's 24 pixels in your case, where you've made that setting in the browser. And it's like, how do you turn? It's like, how do you picture that? Do you picture that, or do you go just straight in it and code it and see what happens?
Right.
And I think those may be the difference. I mean, one of the arguments that I was saying, particularly with the Utopia calculation tool, was that that takes inputs. It takes type scales, which is maybe something we could talk about. But importantly, it asks you in pixels what you want your base font size to be at a big screen and a small screen. And you can also define in pixels what a big screen is to you and what a small screen is. But my view is that because it doesn't use pixels in its output, it uses rems, like the sort of underlying calculation it is thinking kind of rems, but because I think designers, partly driven by the tools that we use, and maybe just because it's how it's always been done, is it's kind of thinking pixels, but you got to kind of start somewhere, haven't you? I think it's also a bit, it's like, I'm not sure how you get around that, but but its output anyway.
Yeah, I think if that's the way that you're thinking, Utopia is the best tool I've seen. It does that really well. We actually use it on a whole lot of our projects because it does that so well. So if you're coming out of sort of thinking of it in terms of what size to what size in terms of pixels, it does the calculations for you, and it gives you an excellent M-based result that's fluid and responsive in all the ways you would want. What I was trying to think through was, I don't know, maybe this is a weird analogy, but I think of linguists talking about like the best way to learn a language is to stop translating it into your primary language, which is a weird thing to think about. what is it? How would I learn a language without translating it? But there's sort of a little bit of a mental shift there of just like learn the word instead of translating the word, take out that extra step.
Yeah.
And I think I'm thinking of M's a little bit that way. I'm trying to think, okay, an M, what if an M represents the user's request instead of a font size? And then my goal with a calculation is how do I make something that is responsive in a way that's nice, has the right, I don't know, scaling factor, while staying close to the user's preference. And so that's how I got to my result of, well, I shouldn't go below the user's preference, so I'll start my clamp at 1em. And then in the middle, I'll say, I'm adding viewport sizes to it, so I'll start that one just slightly below the user's preference and add some viewport size. And then it's that scale factor that I have to get right. And then I'll put a high end that is not too far from the user's preference. So I'll just, it's a little bit random numbers, 1 at the bottom, 1.5 at the top, and some scaling factor. And in there, I haven't done any translation to pixels. And I haven't even said what is the right font size for my design. I've sort of left that entirely out of the question and just said, how much should that scale and how should it be based on what the user asked for? So that's how I got to my result, which is very similar to the result you often come to, but just thinking through it slightly differently.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, because they both work in exactly the same way, and you could end up with very, very similar results, but they've just been, as you say, arrived at through different thought processes. And it's interesting, that idea about sort of skipping the translation, because you can certainly think that way, thinking about type scale. So thinking about in terms of visual hierarchy, size-wise, like how does an H1 relate to the body font, body size, or how does an H2 relate to it? And so if you're thinking type scales, like the modular scales that have been introduced to over the last many years, you might say, well, I want my H1s to be 2.5 times or 3 times the size of my body font. So there you're not saying how big they are in pixels, it's just a multiple, which is obviously what the definition of a scale is. And I think one of the nice things that Utopia helps you to do is think about how you would apply different type scales for different size screens. Because that, again, that becomes necessary. You on a larger screen or a larger viewport, you want those scales to be more exaggerated. But again, they're just relationships from one size to another. What the actual values are might just be how your brain works and how you think about arriving at it. But mostly it's those relationships that you're doing.
Yeah, there's a really interesting point in there, because I was sort of thinking, I like the idea of making the type scales more obvious. I was playing the other day with creating a set of custom properties that are just named like minor second, major second, minor third, basically using the same ones that Utopia has, and then figuring out what the ratio is, and then just using a calc. So a perfect fourth is calc 4 divided by 3. And I can just see that in my code and say, oh, I know what there's the ratio. I can reference it using this name, and it's all right there. But what I would miss if I just used that for, say, an H1 is a perfect fourth or whatever, I could put a calc that has that, calls that variable, multiplies. I'd use the POW function to get the real scaling. I could put all that in my CSS now, which is fun and cool. That's possible to just record all of it. What I miss there that Utopia does, and does really nicely, is that changing the scale over the course of the viewport change. And I would lose that in my approach of trying to simplify these things down.
Yeah, I think that's the real sort of the real killer feature in a way. It is that regardless of you can also set the base font size if you want to, but you don't have to. You could keep it the same, but it's having that scale change dynamically across window sizes, because I'm of the opinion that the general default that browsers use, which is actually based on a classic typographic scale, I think works perfectly on a really small screen like a phone. But as soon as you start to get significantly bigger, you lose the impact there, and also to some degree the sort of scannability, even though like that H1 is exactly the same size as it is on a small screen. Somehow it gets a bit lost when those line lengths get a bit longer and the whole viewport is bigger.
Right.
And that's why I think just aesthetically, but then also, yeah, from a readability, scannability point of view, I think that's why you need different scales at bigger sizes. And of course, something like Utopia means you don't have to do a whole load of breakpoints. It just, you set the two ends, the two extremes, and it interpolates and then clamps and stops it going mad either way. But I for me, that's the thing that does it. And that's, I think that's, we developed Utopia out of a project we were doing at Clear Left, and it was a whole bunch of stuff that the designers were doing in a spreadsheet to make these calculations, and sort of came to that conclusion that we could do a tool to make this so much easier, particularly once we worked out you don't need media queries to do it anymore, because you can use the viewport units, and it's just, yeah, beautiful and smooth.
Yeah. That's interesting. I wonder, I mean, I feel like I have a homework assignment here to see if I can without translation to pixels figure out how to do that same sort of scale adjustment that fits my mental model. Yeah, I
think I don't think it's too much of a stretch to start thinking along those lines, but when you're converting still those, I mean, somehow you've got to have either a picture in front of you of the thing that you are developing and tweaking, or there's a mental picture. One way or another it gets converted to, you know, photons reality, but but not having to make the calculation in your mind of, oh yeah, rem, that's 16 pixels, 16, now if I double that, that's 32. Doing away with that is probably a useful thing if you can still think in proportions, which is really what it comes down to.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I come out of, I don't know, I got into this because I found it interesting to think about interacting with an audience in terms of relationships to their preferences. I don't know. I think that's like the thing that drew me to CSS in the first place was, how far can I set aside the photons? How far down the path can I put that question of what's actually going to get rendered, and instead document the process of getting to it in a way where then I can jump in, and when I adjust my user preferences, it feels like the result is right for that preference.
Yeah.
So I haven't thought too much about what is the right font size for my site. And instead I've thought, what is the right way of arriving at a font size for my site? If I start from this point, and where should I arrive if I start from that point? And figuring out the logic of arriving at a design instead of thinking about the design. But I know that I'm way out there when I think this way, and it's not the way most designers are working.
No, but it is a web-like way of thinking, though. So it doesn't feel wrong. It does feel, I don't know. It feels the right way to think. It's just quite abstract. It's probably difficult, but that not necessarily means that it's wrong or odd even. But yeah, I mean, just that whole idea that when designers come to the web, the whole idea that the reader has much more control than they do, particularly if they've come from a print background where everything is completely controlled from the stock to the typeface to the font. The only thing you can't control is the lighting, and everything otherwise you've got control over absolutely everything else, whereas it's completely the reverse when it comes to the web, and that's why it's so good, and that's why we're having conversations like this to accommodate the fact that people can change the way that they consume what we're putting out there and what we're designing. And I think that's designing for something that where you don't know what the end result's going to be, I think is great. But that's where sort of maths and algorithms come in,
right?
I think to help some of that go along.
Yeah, and it sort of pulls us back around to what you were saying about an onus on browsers to really be the user agent and give the user agency. Allow preferences at a finer grain. Stacy, you've been sitting quiet for a half hour. Do you have thoughts?
I've been managing things all behind the scenes here. Yeah, I'm curious. I read your excellent article, Rich, and you were talking about how stakeholders want to see a design in maybe a number of contexts before they'll sign off on that. So what is your design process like when planning out these type scales? Do you start with Utopia first, or like how does that work in the flow? Because obviously that's like much more code related, and you get these clamps, and a lot of our design apps don't have that ability. So how do you handle that?
So at Clearleft, we do have our designers working closely with the developers, and we almost always use Utopia when it comes to the type, and we often start with the type as well, because of the nature of the kind of sites that we do. They're often information led or that kind of thing. So typography, one way or another, is really important. But thinking about Utopia specifically, there are plugins for Figma which can really help do that. So it helps with the type scales, and so because then a designer can think in those kind of utopian way of thinking around type scales. Yes, you're still setting a base font size probably of 16 pixels because you've got to set something if you're going to paint pictures of a website. And I think, was it Brad Frost, someone like that, said something like, Figma is the best way of showing a client what your website won't look like.
Stephen Hay, I think.
But it will look similar, probably, depending on the circumstances and what you want them to sort of see. But for us, it's a starting point of getting the ideas together of this is the design direction, this is what some of these components on this page are going to look like. And then it becomes a conversation with the developer who's starting to take that, and then all the responsiveness really starts to happen in those conversations. And how do we want that component to react? What if it's in a different context? How do we want it to react then? So then you're starting to work in the browser, and not necessarily worrying at all what actual size in pixels anything is. But that might be a starting point, because you've got to set it in Figma, and if Figma and other design tools is your starting point for designs that you need to, clients to buy into one way or another, it tends to be easier and quicker to do that in Figma than it does to then build it, or even if it's a prototype of it. And that just seems to be the process. But it is a collaborative one once you've sort of got over that. Yeah, let's go with that hump and start dealing with all the responsiveness, because that is just you're on a hiding to nothing on trying to do that in any design tool, really.
What does the Utopia to Figma plugin give you? And does it feel like enough, or does it feel like Figma should have other features here that help with understanding responsiveness?
As I understand it, it uses the Figma's variables now, so it is set up so that then the main thing about it is that you then have you can change the steps in a scale. So that's what Utopia outputs essentially is steps, kind of. It might be like -1 to 5, where 0 is your base font size. And so the designer can think in those steps, which means that then when talking to the developer, they're saying the heading is step 5. And so that's what you use as your CSS variable. And it's the same thing in Figma. The heading is step 5. And so the way that we often work is, if we're going to mock up something close to a whole page, it would be on the smallest size and the largest size that we're considering. And working in those extremes, because those are sort of the inputs that Utopia takes as well. And then everything that happens in the middle becomes a conversation, and then tweaking with the CSS in the browser itself to see, well, what happens in between those two extremes. But in the meantime, in terms of trying to work out how these interfaces might work and what to show to a client, they tend to be working on those two extremes. And that's where those variables can really work within Figma. And again, you can tweak those in combination with what you've got with Utopia. So you're talking the same language. And I think that's the most useful thing. It really speeds up those conversations. So they're never talking pixels, they're talking steps.
Right. Yeah, that's very similar to how I think Oddbird does it. I don't know if we always have them named in Figma. I'm not in the Figma files as much as you, Stacy.
And in fairness, nor am I.
But you know, when a design gets kicked over to me to implement, I don't look at the pixel size in Figma. I get one of the predefined sizes from the scale, and I use that. So that's very similar. And then we play with it in the browser, and we'll often do pairing, sort of a engineer and a designer as a final step. Sometimes asynchronous, sometimes synchronous, but going over it together to see if it's moving correctly. The way
we do have our design tokens in some projects. Like Oddbooks has all the size and color tokens in Figma, so you can reference it by name.
Nice. Well, I had something else there, but I blanked on it. But Alan has an interesting question in the comments, asking about tying in font sizes to other considerations. And this was actually originally part of my blog post, and I cut it because it was too long. And I'd like to get to that blog post at some point. But I'm interested in this question too. How do the ratios between headings and body text, as those change, how does it impact margins and padding and other considerations? Line height maybe would be another one. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of simple answer of yes, but in as much as the tools that are available within Utopia, they also have versions which will do essentially spacing tokens, which are based directly from the type size, but you can have slightly different things going on, which is really clever in terms of the responsiveness there. So again, these, like the type size, you can in theory use the type tokens, those variables, to set a padding. So you could say where you're having like size 0 is what you set for the type size on your paddings. You can, on your font size, you can just set it on a inline padding if that's what you want as well. But one of the things that Utopia can do is have really radical differences. So on a small screen, it could say you can go from, and it deals in t-shirt sizes again. So it's kind of abstracting these things. So you might have a spacing token of extra small, but on a bigger screen that goes up to extra large. And so it's not just whether the type size, if you were setting a step, that would just be on your type scale. But here you can get like radically different things, which help with the layout in some cases where you have so much more real estate. You just need more breathing around those bigger typefaces and things like that. And I think that particularly works, I would say, probably in that vertical plane where you have where you have it in a horizontal plane. I prefer like percentages of the screen width for that, because then obviously when the window gets narrower, those percentages render much smaller, and which kind of makes sense to me because you've got much less space to deal with. So I think you can work in a couple of different ways. But yeah, all the time you have those effectively variables which are tied ultimately back to the root font size one way or another. You can use them for spacing, and that can be really helpful.
Yeah, I'd be interested in seeing tools that, I mean, I like that Utopia has that spacing tool. I've been thinking about different units for this and how they play into it in CSS. I mean, again, a lot of these relative units don't exist in a tool like Figma. So then if you want to play with the same idea there, you have to translate it into pixels. But that's actually part of what we talked to Alan about a couple months ago. If you want to go watch that conversation. But, I've been playing with, I think similar to you, the horizontal spacing being based somewhat on the viewport. But then I've been playing with like round and min and max functions. We can do rounding now in CSS. So we can say, I want it to be related to the font size in its rounding. I want it to round to a percent of the font size or something. But I want it to be based on the viewport size, and I want it to be a minimum of 8 pixels or 12 pixels or whatever. I want it to not get too small and too tight. And then on the vertical, using even just line height units instead of M units, saying really the spacing that I want between paragraphs isn't a factor of the font size. It's I want one line. And 1LH gives me that, and I can adjust that by changing what the line height is.
Something I like to do is if you're laying out text where you like to have your paragraphs indented rather than spaced, then I like that indent to be related to the line height. It can be one line height, and so having that unit now rather than hoping that it doesn't change at some point is quite nice. And similar with bullet points, bullet indents have that as one line height or two line heights depending on your spacing. I quite like having those relationships tied together. They work quite well.
While we're on this, and before we lose you, you wrote a post a while back about using character units for line length. That I thought was really interesting and controversial. Do you want to talk some about that?
I think because I went down the is harmful route in terms of the title of a blog post, and someone said that's just going to put people off using new CSS units, and I don't want that to be the case. So that's why it's got a weird title now. But the main thing was I do think that so when we're talking about setting, say, a maximum length to a line, the maximum measure of a line to keep it nice and readable, there is this number sort of going around. We can have a range like 45 to 65 characters, something like that. And that range that's been publicized in books, particularly Robert Bringhurst's Elements of Typographic Style. But he's just derived that from what is done generally and has been done for hundreds of years. It's like the designers have correctly ended up at this width. So let's say it's a maximum width of 66 characters. But what it doesn't mean is actual characters. Characters at that point is a proxy for an actual width, which if you're using a normal kind of serif typeface, kind of standard typeface, or sans serif, that would be kind of a regular thing that's easy to read, then it would be about 66 characters. But setting it using the CH unit, the ch unit for character, I think is wrong, because then your line length starts changing depending on the design of the typeface. And so and I think Alan made this really good point when he was talking about it. If you have a web font and that web font doesn't load, or you have a bunch of sort of different fallbacks and the web font doesn't load, then your layout's going to change depending on the typeface that actually gets used to render it. And also, if you're using a very conservative way to load the web fonts, so the web font might be coming in at some point, then the layout's going to shift, because you're saying, because the chuck character is based on the width of the 0, and the width of a 0 might be different from typeface to typeface. And so I think it's wrong. I think it's taken that 66 characters too literally, and I think it should be the equivalent in ems. And then
so in some ways, so in some ways the M is more reliable because it doesn't change based on the font that loads. You don't get the flash of wrong line length.
Yeah,
I don't know if that.
And that line length is set there for your reading, and the length of a line is not easier or harder to read depending on the typeface. It's so much it's how long that line should be, and I don't see that it should vary with the typeface design or the width of a 0 in this case. I think that should be the same regardless of the typeface choice. So I think it's just been taken a bit too literally. People got a bit too excited about that.
I was one of the people getting too excited about it.
But it's great for other purposes where you do want it to change.
Yeah.
Where you're setting, where maybe you'll have an expanded typeface and a condensed typeface, and you want it to show perhaps exactly the same text and have the lines wrapping in exactly the same way. But because they're completely different designs, you can't rely on ems to do that. That's where you might want a character unit to set it. So you've got the text wrapping at the same point in the text. That might be an example, but I'm sure there's lots of other reasons to use it as well, but I don't think setting the measure is one of them.
So controversially, you're arguing that you should use units that mean what you intend to mean instead of choosing one best unit for everything.
Yes, I think so. That's right. But you can see where it's come from. It's like, because that word characters is always used in the prose, in the writing that's written about it, and suddenly we have this character unit, and it's like, oh, perfect. So, but it isn't perfect because, the actual use that you're really intending is not the same thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, Stacy pulled up this question from James, asking about the rationale behind T-shirt sizes in Utopia spacing, but steps for font sizes. Do you know the rationale there?
So the steps of font sizes is because that's steps calculated in a scale, like you were saying, like the major fourth, whatever it might be. So those are literally steps in a scale, whereas the T-shirt sizes seemed more appropriate. I mean, I'm guessing now because I didn't. Utopia is not my thing. I just love it, and it was created by colleagues of mine, James and Tris at Clear Left. But the T-shirt sizes, I think, give you more scope because they can be so different. They're based on multiples of the type size, so extra large. I forget what the multiple is, but it might be 10 times the type size, and so your scale to reach that would be different. So that's why it's different purposes. And so we thought, well, it's easier to think about them in different ways as well from that point of view. But like I said, you can use the type scale for your spacing if you wanted to. Those are lengths essentially for you to use it as you wish. But yeah, for spacing, it felt like those T-shirt sizes were a bit better.
Plus, you need a word anyway, right?
Yeah.
I like, I mean, if I was sharing my screen, the visualizations in Utopia are just fantastic. I mean, it's just such a good tool for seeing what it's doing. It does a great job of taking inputs that reflect how a designer thinks and giving outputs and showing what they do. It is really a beautiful tool. Tris and James, good work.
Yeah.
Was that a hint that I should be sharing my screen?
Oh, no. That's
okay.
fine.
I was like, oh, no.
But go check out utopia.fyi. It really is a good tool. So what was this other a question that came in.
From Sue.
When container style queries, oh, go ahead.
When container style queries are available, will we be able to pinpoint which font in the stack is used?
I don't think style queries will get us there, because they're looking at the computed value of something, and the computed value of a font is still the whole list, or of font family is still the whole list of fallbacks. So we would need something else there. And since Alan is in the chat, I assume he'll solve it as the chair of the working group.
I mean, I know there are, and have been for quite some time, JavaScript events to be able to detect when a web font has loaded, but it doesn't tell you, if it hasn't, which font then down the font stack is actually being used to render this page.
And I imagine there might actually be issues here with privacy. There's a lot of issues around what font loads.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess that's local fonts. What font is used if you're looking at, if you're not providing a web font, which I guess is when you would get a fallback, right? Is you're getting a local font from the user's computer. And there's a lot of fingerprinting you can do by saying what fonts are available for different users. So I don't know how easy that would be to solve.
And Safari's put some limits on that now. You can't just use any local font anymore with Safari like you used to be able to do, which threw me for a long time. It's like I didn't realize that was the case, and it's like, why is this font not working? But yeah, so I think that's partly to counteract that fingerprinting.
I always just throw fantasy in between. I'll like put fantasy as the second one, and then like courier, so that's like super obvious when your first choice isn't showing up.
Right. That works in testing, but does it work in production?
Just in the inspector locally. Yeah, I don't do that. I don't push that anywhere.
I thought I'd mention that while we just have time, there's a bug in the current version of Safari, at least on a Mac, where where we were talking about bumping up type size, that's broken at the moment. Any font size which uses a calc, even if we're just doing calc 1 pixel, so it's not actually doing an operation, it breaks and you can't adjust the type size currently. But it's been fixed for the next version. But if in this current version, it got broken for some reason. So again, that was another one that threw me for a while. But yeah, so you try to go to my site, for example, in Safari and try to bump the text size up and down. Nothing happens, which is a bit rubbish. But like I said, it's there, and the current development version has it fixed. So hopefully that will just propagate, and we can forget about that.
Yeah, that's surprising. Glad it's getting fixed. Is there anything else we want to get in the final minutes, or is this a good place to wrap it up?
I haven't got anything on my agenda.
Great. Well, it's been really lovely talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Is there a place where people can find you online, on social media or a website?
Yep, clagnut.com. You can find me there. I'm on Mastodon and Blue Sky as well. Rutter normally on those two, so you'll find me there as well.
Yeah, great. And we'll link to you in the show notes as well.
We're going to have a full show note list of links today. So go check that out in a while and put a calendar date from a year from now to see if the second edition of the book is ready. Maybe we'll add that to the show notes as well. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rich. We really enjoyed speaking with you. And again, we've had a lovely conversation that lasted almost an hour about like one specific thing. So I think it's very exciting when you're passionate about something like typography that you can really talk about it forever. Oddbird, if if anyone is interested, is available for hire. I have this banner image here, but it's going to be behind us. We've never figured out what to do with that. Maybe we'll figure that out
someday.
one day.
We'll learn how to stream.
Yeah, one day. If anyone has any tips for me. Let me see. I'm going to get this to work. Pardon me. But then we have to hide us. No.
Push us to the side.
There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Hey, hire us to build custom web projects. I promise we're better at web development than streaming. So there we go.
We've been doing it longer.
Much longer, yes. Please visit oddbird.net/winging it to access all those links that we mentioned today on the show. The next Winging It, we will have James and Miriam discussing invoker commands with our special guest, Luke Warlow. If you'd like to support us, please like and subscribe. And if you'd like more from Oddbird, we invite you to check out our newsletter at oddbird.net/oddnews or oddbird.dev, as you see on the screen right now, because we apparently have multiple domains. Miriam, do you want to talk about our open collective?
Oh yeah, so the working group, this is a little bit related to what we were talking about today. The working group just decided to add a size shorthand for setting width and height, which raised the obvious question from a lot of people: what about a shorthand for setting inline size and block size, the logical properties? Which size seems like it would be a shorthand for that potentially, but it's not. There's actually an issue to solve this and several proposals to solve this in the working group, but they've been stalled for several years. And I would love to just go and do the research that is blocking that, if I can get some funding to do that. So I set up an open collective little goal. If people want to fund solving the logical shorthands property, I would love to put some work into that. So donate to support that work if you're interested.
All right, link will be in the show notes as well. And that's all we have here today. Do either of you have anything else to add? No? All right, thank you all for tuning in. And remember, best practice is a conversation, so let's keep talking.